Welcome. Welcome everybody. My name is Chris Weiss. On behalf of the DC Environmental Network and City Wildlife, represented today by Ann Lewis, we want to welcome you to our webinar, "The Living Sentinels Monitoring Wildlife to Prevent the Proliferation of New Diseases," featuring local, national, and international wildlife and health experts as they explore the complex connections between wildlife rehabilitation and trade and the current pandemic-driven global health crisis. We have a few announcements here. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A box. Comments can go in the chat box. We will go through all three speakers before we read and answer participants' questions. We may try and consolidate similar themes. Also, this webinar is being recorded. We hope to make this video available at a later date. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, our very special moderator, DC Councilperson Mary Che. Mary Che has served on the Council of the District of Columbia since 2007 and is currently the chair of the Committee on Transportation and the Environment. As a council member, Mary has championed several bills to protect wildlife and the environment, including the Clean and Affordable Energy Act, the Wildlife Protection Act, the Clean Energy DC Act, as well as legislation to limit pesticide use, improve water quality, control light pollution, and promote sustainability practices. Mary is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Douglas College and received her law degrees from Rutgers and Harvard universities. I am very happy to welcome our environmental friend, Mary Che.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon to everybody. As indicated, I am Councilmember Mary Che, and as Chris also mentioned, I'm the chair of the Transportation and Environment Committee of the Council of the District of Columbia. And from some of the things he's mentioned, we've been very fortunate in the district to have made significant strides in protecting animals, both domestic and in the wild, including protections generally for the environment and for urban wildlife. But the horrific treatment of wildlife around the world, capturing, killing, holding in abominable circumstances, leading to extinctions, and of course, the subject of this webinar, the transfer of diseases and now pandemics, to the human population. So we need to talk about this because we need to stop this torture, stop this transfer of diseases, even if we want to simply act out of self-interest. And I hope that, this webinar will educate listeners and help us figure out ways that we can act to stop this. Now, there is a lot of truth, to this philosophical principle that the manner in which we treat animals and other living things is a reflection of our own values and ethical standards. Now, being one of the more prosperous and progressive communities in the country, the District of Columbia will embrace, I believe, every opportunity to become a national leader in humane policies and adopt compassion-based approaches to domestic and wild animal management and care. And in those pursuits, I simply have to say that it's been really a pleasure to support the work of our animal advocacy community, especially today's panel host, DC Environmental Network and City Wildlife. So to begin, our first panelist is John Hadidian. Dr. Hadidian currently serves as a board member for City Wildlife, a science advisor for Project Coyote, and the vice president of the District Coyote Project. He is the global ambassador for Wellbeing International and an adjunct associate lecturer for Virginia Tech Center for Leadership in Global Sustainability. He previously served as the director of the Urban Wildlife Program at the Humane Society of the United States from 1996 to 2011. And he's worked as a senior scientist for the Wildlife Protection Program until his retirement in 2016. And before his work with the Humane Society of the United States, he was the urban wildlife biologist for the National Park Service's Center for Urban in Ecology for 10 years right here in the district. So at that, I'd like to invite Dr. Hadidian to make his presentation. Doctor?
Thank you, Councilmember Che. We'll share my screen now, and I hope I can do this according to Hoyle. Please tell me if this is not coming through. And I will try to start a slideshow here to begin. Well, I'm trying to meet this demand, which is probably beyond my technical capabilities. I do want to thank Chris Weiss and the DC Environmental Network folks for sponsoring this event. And I want to give a special thanks to Mary Che, Councilmember Che, because she has been a staunch supporter and advocate for city wildlife, beginning with its founding and continuing on until present times. Okay, I hope you're seeing a full screen now. And what I would like to do today in a very brief period of time is talk about the idea of wildlife as sentinels from a very, very local and kind of on the ground perspective. And to do that, I'll talk about city wildlife, I'll talk about wildlife rehabilitation, and then I'll talk about the concept of wildlife as sentinels, and try to conclude with what the future seems to hold for us in respect to wildlife rehabilitation. But first, a quick word about city wildlife. President Ann Lewis and Executive Director Jim Mansma created this concept, championed it, brought it to, through all of the various processes of approval back in 2008. We found space for a clinic. That clinic opened in 2013 and became immediately a place where people could bring injured or orphaned wildlife for treatment in the district. Since its opening, we've had about 11,000 animal patients from about approximately 100 different species. So it's been busy. And significantly, we think that 25% of the species we've seen have been listed by the district as species of special concern, special conservation concern. So for those of you who know wildlife rehabilitation is, we bring injured animals and provide them with expert medical care. And we take orphaned animals and we raise them to a point where they and the animals that are treated and we're caring for can be taken back into their natural habitat and released, fully functioning, capable of reproducing, contributing to the continuance of their species, and sometimes leaving us by air, sometimes a little bit more slowly by land, but however it is, they're always happy to be back where they belong, and we're always delighted to see them there. We have three goals with city wildlife that we express and articulate. The first and most obvious one is to protect wildlife. And we obviously do this by taking care of the injured and orphaned. The second goal is to protect the environment, since without it, the wildlife hasn't got a place that it really can be safe. Fortunately for us and for the residents of the District of Columbia, it's just a beautiful environment in Washington, D.C., anchored by a lot of National Park Service land that provides a lot of amenities, a lot of opportunities, and a lot of good habitat for wildlife species. The third goal is a little bit less intuitive, and that is to protect people, because we traditionally have seen it as a need that otherwise compassionate and well-meaning individuals who might pick up an orphaned bird, an injured squirrel, and try to rehabilitate it at home would be exposing themselves unnecessarily to a certain amount of risk. So, I mean, injury from being bitten or scratched and things like pathogens that some of these wild species carry that can be transmitted to humans. So we've always felt that. We've always proceeded on that basis. But now all of a sudden we're in a brand new world where everything is getting a little bit different and a little bit more complex. And we're finding that we have an opportunity to assume another role. And that's a role that begins with a discussion or a conversation about wildlife as, or animals as sentinels. And to start that discussion, I would like to mention the proverbial canary in the coal mine, which is something that was first brought to the attention of the medical professional community probably back in the 1890s by a Scottish physician named J.B.S. Haldane. Haldane argued that small animals, mice and birds, if taken into the mines because of their higher metabolism, would succumb sooner to the accumulation of toxic gases than would the miners, and could provide a kind of early warning system for the miners. They see these birds or mice or whatever they had in distress, and they would, rush out of the mine with their charges and avoid succumbing themselves. The canary became the standard and the most popular probably because they sing while you're down in the mines, and that's entertaining, and they're just nice birds to have around. And they were so popular, and so miners were so fond of using them that they didn't phase this out until about the mid-1980s, when electronic sensing devices, which were much more sensitive, indeed came into use. It was also at about that time that we here, through our National Academy of Sciences, began to look at this concept in a broader way. The Academy charged the National Research Council with bringing together experts and collating all of the information that we had available through science up to that time on animals as sentinels for environmental hazards. And it's a long story, and there's lots of things that went on there, but suffice it to say that many, many studies that had been conducted then and subsequently continued have demonstrated that wild animals can serve as really good sentinels for toxic air, toxic water, chemicals in the environment. There was a lot of use of animal sentinels back in the days when we had leaded gasoline to try to demonstrate or to document how much environmental lead was present. And all of that was, fully recognized and fully appreciated, and began to make us more broadly aware of the relationship we had with animals as we tried to cope with mutual problems going forward. And disease, of course, as we now know, is one of the most prominent and compelling issues that we face. And the human-animal relationship in disease is very, very important, assuming greater importance all the time. This was addressed in antiquity or in older times as well. I think of Jenner and smallpox and pasture and rabies. Of course, we have great examples, but it was really not until the 1920s that we began to understand or to visualize this in a more comprehensive way. This, in 1924, saw the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, that being the acronym of the organization's original name in French, come into being, and that created a really comprehensive effort to bring different nations together at the same place and same time and on to the table to talk about how to monitor and how to guess in this equation of wildlife or animal-human disease relationships. And I keep saying wildlife, but it also includes of course, animals we raise for production as well as our companion animals. So all of that effort through the years has accumulated a tremendous amount of information and engagement that involves, I don't know, maybe 150 more plus member states that share information, that track wildlife disease outbreaks, and among all of those other functions promotes this One Health concept, which is another thing that is really important to us right now and really should be something that we begin to focus a lot more. Began in antiquity, but is something that has been around and talked about comprehensively for only about 20 years. And it simply involves taking a look at the relationship between people, animals, and the environment, and recognizing all three as significant factors in advancing and promoting issues concerning health. So this is a grab from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website that focuses on One Health. Other groups and organizations, the University of Washington being a good example, they actually maintain a database called the Canary database, are on top of this issue of surveillance, understanding, collaborating, communicating, and coordinating responses to wildlife disease outbreaks. And there are lots of them. I mean, we've only recently begun to discover how many there are, as others who will follow will explain in more detail, but looking at things like Ebola, SARS, MERS, avian flu, some of these much more highly pathogenic than this coronavirus that we're struggling with now, but not as, fortunately, not as easily transmitted. So that brings us back to the future and to the wildlife rehabilitation community and the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. And I just want to sum up with three very simple things about this. One is that we think this is one of the very best potential early warning systems that we could implement, because we directly see animals that are compromised, wild animals that are compromised that come into our center, and they're directly seen by medical professionals, wildlife medical professionals, as well as trained wildlife rehabilitators. So we recognize problems pretty early. And we also are in a really good position to recognize clusters of cases. When we have repeated events occurring, then that starts to set off certain kinds of alarm bells. We're also conducting urban surveillance. Some interesting work coming out of the Urban Wildlife Institute in Chicago, following the prevalence of common diseases, and I'm thinking common problems, pathogens like salmonella, diseases like Lyme, and things in urban birds, shows that it occurs along a gradient and of these things then outside areas, suburbs and rural areas. And it draws to our attention that we need to know what's going on in our communities, in our own communities. So we're seeing things that are specific to and important to the district when we do that kind of surveillance. And then finally, this issue of networking, which DC is a fabulous community for this. We have all of the governmental Humane Rescue Alliance and the National Park Service, which is a major land manager in DC, all of whom we have great relationships and can work seamlessly with and expand if necessary beyond. That includes specialists from the National Zoo, the consortium of universities, the Council of Government folks. It just goes on, not to mention all of the NGOs in Washington, D.C., who all can be part of this, what we think is going to have to be a new scenario for us all in creating better communications, better coordinations, and certainly better surveillance at the local level. So that's basically what I feel is important about the role of wildlife rehabilitation in this concept that we're discussing today. And I can conclude there with a nice picture of mallards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hadidian. Our next panelist is going to focus on the current coronavirus pandemic and its connection to wildlife trade. Dr. Teresa Telecki is the Vice President for Wildlife at Humane Society International. Dr. Telecki is a zoologist by training and has worked on animal protection advocacy for the past 30 years. She specializes in wildlife trade and is an expert on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Dr. Telecki, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to City Wildlife for inviting me to be here today with you. I'll just share my screen. That might take a moment. Bear with me. Just need to make a little adjustment here. All right, very good. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the current pandemic, COVID-19, and the wildlife trade, and what we can do to prevent future pandemics from starting. And before we get into that topic too much, I think we have to take a moment just to understand what is a virus. I'm sure there are many people on this call today who know what a virus is, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Viruses are very simple infectious agents. They cause a lot of trouble, but they're actually very simple in structure. They consist of really just 3 parts. One part is the RNA or DNA, which of course is where the building blocks of life are located. This is surrounded by a protein coat, and surrounding that is a lipid envelope. And really that's all there is to a virus. They don't have a brain. They're not out to get us or to dominate the world. This is all they are. But they are very good at what they do, which is to invade the cells of animals or plants and take over the machinery of those cells and replicate themselves. And during this replication process, they're just churning out copies and copies and copies of themselves. Errors are going to be made, and errors are made. And this is how you wind up with lots of different varieties of viruses, and this is how new viruses, such as the one that causes COVID, develop. It's completely by random chance that the right elements come together to create something that results in a pandemic like COVID. Moving on to how these viruses, like COVID, came to become a global pandemic. The next thing we need to look at is bats. Bats are wonderful creatures, but they're also the natural reservoir for many viruses, including coronaviruses. And bats have been found to have more viruses than any other mammals. And so to understand why this is so, we just have to look at what is it that bats provide viruses that makes viruses associate with bats. Well, for one, they're very long-lived. So this gives them plenty of time once a bat has a virus to pass it on to other bats. So this is very advantageous to viruses. Bats are the only flying mammal. So naturally they cover long distances, and therefore that's advantageous to viruses because it allows the viruses to spread. Bats socially roost. So in these settings, bats can transfer viruses from one bat to another, from one species to another. So this again is advantageous to viruses. Bats are distributed worldwide And there are lots and lots of species of bats. In fact, 20% of mammalian species are bats. So that's lots of variety for viruses to infect. And lastly, bats, although they carry a lot of viruses, are often asymptomatic for those viruses. That is, they do not become sick themselves. There are special viruses of bats, of course, but they also carry a lot of viruses that don't make them sick, but they are basically transmitting these viruses to other animals, other bats and other animals. And scientists have found that bats all over the world carry coronaviruses, which is, of course, a coronavirus is the one that causes the current pandemic. But, you know, while we talk about bats as being the host of coronaviruses worldwide, we also have to recognize that we shouldn't demonize bats when we talk about them in this way. I mean, bats are obviously very important ecologically as pollinators, seed dispersers, and for insect control. And we need to, you know, make clear that wiping out all the bats is not the way to deal with lowering the risk for future pandemics. So it's not surprising at all to people who study the wildlife trade that we are in the midst of a pandemic. There have been a couple of warning signs just in the last 2 decades. The first of which was the severe acute respiratory syndrome outbreak, or SARS outbreak, which started in 2002 in China and killed 800 people and infected 8,000 people, which pales in comparison, obviously, to the current pandemic. But the virus that causes SARS is very closely related to the virus that causes COVID. Both are SARS type viruses. And so that was our first warning within the last 2 decades. And our second warning, another coronavirus, was the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, which started in 2012 in Saudi Arabia, killed 2,249 people, infected 2,249 people, and 787 of those people died. Both of these diseases, originated from a virus that was carried by bats. Studies over the years have shown that there was an intermediate host in both the case of SARS and the case of MERS, whereas the host was bats, local bats. The intermediate host for SARS was a civet, which was being, civets, which were being offered for sale in a wildlife market in China. And the intermediate hosts for MERS were domesticated camels being kept by people in Saudi Arabia. The intermediate host of COVID is still not known. Scientific studies are way to determine that, and there are some possibilities out there, but it has not been definitively determined at this time. So what we've seen from these particular cases, both SARS and MERS, is that there was an intermediate host involved in between the bats and the humans. And that is also the situation that we are seeing unfold with the current pandemic. So when we look at SARS and COVID, both of these diseases originated in wildlife markets in China. Now, I'm sure that many of you have heard about these markets. They're sometimes called wet markets. That's actually an inaccurate term. But I'm sure many of you have heard about them. Animals of dozens, if not hundreds of different species are intermingled together in these markets. They're being held in very inhumane conditions that are unhealthful for them and stressful to them. And we know that generally when animals are stressed, they will shed viruses. Any viruses they have, they will shed more of when they're under stress. So we have the situation where we have lots of different animals, lots of different species, predators and prey, right next to each other, a lot of stress, a lot of shedding of viruses. And on top of that, you have a situation where these animals are being purchased and slaughtered in these markets. So on top of the normal respiratory fluids, you would also have blood and other body fluids being splattered about the market. And then you add on top of that the people who work in the market, who basically are almost living there because of the long hours that they are spending around these animals working in the market and slaughtering them and what have you. And you have the customers coming and going and buying and leaving and coming and going. And so really you could not invent a more perfect situation in which viruses could be passed from animals to humans and vice versa as well, I'm sure. And this is where the COVID pandemic originated, is in this perfect environment for the spread of disease. And to make matters worse, for the past 40 years, China has actually encouraged wildlife farming and trade as a rural development policy. And as a result of this, by the time that COVID struck, there were 20,000 wild animal breeding operations in the country worth about $20 billion annually in trade. So we have to keep in mind that a lot of people's livelihoods were based on this trade. As I said, scientists have known for a long time that the situation was basically a ticking time bomb. And in addition to the way that these animals are kept and in these exotic markets, and the people and the animals coming into such close contact and everything that I've just described for you, in addition to that, bats in China carry all of the building blocks for these viruses that have become harmful to human health. So people, of course, after SARS, went out into the wild and started studying bats to look at what viruses actually are they carrying. And what they found is that all those building blocks are there. So you have to layer that on top of this already dangerous situation of these wildlife markets. And of course, plus, it goes without saying, there's a culture in China of eating exotic mammals, and that was promoted by the government over the past some decades. So obviously we have a very problematic situation here, which is causing high risk for pandemics, and that needs to be addressed. So our conclusion, based on everything that has happened, is perhaps obviously that what we need is a ban on wildlife trade, transport, and consumption to reduce the risk of another pandemic. Now, that's not going to do anything about this pandemic we're currently involved in, but even while we're dealing with this pandemic, we have to know that out there in the world, there are lots of these kinds of markets going on. And so the threat has still not been addressed, even while we're struggling to address this pandemic. Kind of sobering. So thankfully, one country we don't have to worry about anymore is China. And I can tell you, I was more surprised. Everyone who works in the wildlife trade, on the wildlife trade issue, was really surprised at how fast China moved against the wildlife trade for human consumption. So basically, less than 2 months after COVID became known, was identified as a problem, China's Standing Committee of the National People's Congress banned wild animal consumption for food. And that alone has really saved millions of animals from really horrendous treatment in this trade. But they really acted swiftly, and you may wonder, well, is it really being implemented and enforced? And I can tell you now, what, 6 or however many months it's been since this has been established in February, I can tell you that occasionally we do hear, rumors that, oh, such and such a market is happening. But we have groups we work with in China, and they go out and take a look for those markets, and they can't find them. So as far as we know, this ban is being enforced and implemented, which may be surprising to many people. But when China wants to do something, it really can do it. So a couple of problems with this ban. I mean, it's great. The ban is great, but a couple of loopholes, let's put it that way, is that the ban did not include farmed wildlife. So all those farms that we talked about the government has been promoting did not initially include them. Now it does, with the exception of farms raising 3 species of deer. All the other wildlife farming for human consumption activities have been stopped in China, which is, if you had told me this was going to happen a year ago, I would have said you're crazy, but here we are. And the other thing about this ban that you know, frankly, we worry about a little bit is that assuming that, and I'm sure we will eventually get the COVID pandemic under control, there is a concern that China might reverse all of this progress that's been made, because what happened is after the SARS outbreak in 2002, after that started to dissipate, China actually, they had banned these wildlife markets for human food. But then when the SARS virus started to go away, they let the markets come back. And so we surely do not want that to happen again. And hopefully, even though we as a human species apparently ignored the threats, even though they were made clear to us through SARS and through MERS, hopefully we're not going to make that mistake. The human race will not make that mistake again. So just to shift gears a little bit, well, what has Humane Society International been doing about it? What can we do to try to get, urge countries to get a handle on this and do what we think needs to be done, which is to ban wildlife trade, transport, and consumption? So what we did is in April, so, really quickly after the pandemic became a known factor, we issued what we call a white paper on wildlife markets and COVID-19. And this white paper contains all of the scientific information in support of our call to ban the wildlife trade. We had that translated into 11 different languages, and we sent it to 188 governments around the world. And through our normal work, we have a lot of contacts with governments on wildlife issues. And so this is something that's in our wheelhouse for sure. We sent them the white paper. We asked them to ban wildlife trade, transport, and consumption. We asked them to do 2 other things too. Number 1, educate the public about the risk that these activities pose to global human health, which at that time in April was not as apparent as it certainly is now. And in addition, we asked governments to help people whose livelihoods are involved in wildlife trade to transition to other alternative livelihoods that don't pose such a high risk to global public health and the global economy. We also reached out to the World Health Organization, which really, its role is really quite limited. The best it can do really is advise its member countries to do this or that. And so naturally, we asked the WHO to advise its member countries to ban wildlife trade, transport, and human consumption. And we also asked them to address another issue, which is this traditional Chinese medicine. So although the China ban is on human consumption as food, people consume wildlife in China for other reasons as well, such as traditional medicine. And so we urged the WHO to back away a little bit from their acceptance and promotion and support for traditional Chinese medicine when it comes to the use of wild animals in traditional Chinese medicine, because you can clamp down on the food, but if you don't also clamp down on the use in traditional Chinese medicine, then you're not going to be able to address the problem holistically. And shortly after we we contacted the WHO about this. The Director General, in a videotaped press conference, said he'd like to clarify WHO's position on this. Governments must rigorously enforce bans on the sale and trade of wildlife as food. So this is about as good as you can get from WHO. There's no WHO police or anything like that. The best that you can do is, hope that the WHO will influence its member governments. So this was great. We also contacted a number of other, and are still, even to this day, contacting a number of other global bodies to urge them to similarly urge their members to ban wildlife trade. And one of those organizations is the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, that Dr. Hadidian mentioned in his presentation. And we are also working toward a meeting coming up of the G20. That's a group of governments that are the European Union governments, as well as 19 other countries are members of the G20. And they normally talk about economic issues, but we're urging members of the G20 to make a statement not only about the economic harm, obviously, of this pandemic, but also urging members of the G20 to ban the wildlife trade. And lastly, just to mention, of course, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Similarly, we are reaching out to them. And so through our outreach to these global bodies, what we're hoping to do is get them on board with our idea of banning the wildlife trade and urging their members to ban the wildlife trade, educating the public, and also helping people to transition from these wildlife trade-based livelihoods. And lastly, just to share with you that since the COVID outbreak and since we started working on this issue, which really is since the beginning of this year, more and more countries and also even provinces around the world have taken their own actions to either outright ban the wildlife trade or ban certain wildlife trade or put other restrictions in place. And I would say that there is no perfect country or province or jurisdiction on earth that has done the perfect thing, but a lot of governments have really taken some great steps, including most recently Vietnam, which banned the import of wildlife, all wildlife. And which, again, if you had told me this was going to happen a year ago, I would have said never. So that brings us up to date as to where we are, and that brings us to the end of my presentation. And I thank you very much for listening. And again, thanks to City Wildlife for having me here today. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Telecki. That was a devastating account of what's happened, but also the hopeful part at the end. And I'm sure others have questions, as I do, about much of that. In any case, we're going to turn now to our final panelist, Dr. David Wiebers. Dr. Wiebers is an emeritus professor of neurology and consultant emeritus in neurology and clinical epidemiology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He's authored more than 360 scientific publications, 6 medical textbooks, and 3 books for the general public, and has been the recipient of 24 international and 55 United States awards for scientific and medical achievement. Dr. Wiebers has served on the boards of 9 national and international charitable organizations, including serving for 9 years as the chair of the board of the Humane Society of the United States and 14 years as chair of the board of the Humane Society Legislative Fund. The title of Dr. Wiebers' presentation, What the COVID-19 Crisis is Telling Humanity, corresponds to the title of his recent article, which has received widespread acclaim following its publication in the International Medical Journal, Neuroepidemiology, earlier this year. So welcome to you, Dr. Wiebers, and we can't wait to hear your presentation.
Okay, let me share my screen here. We'll go to good. Well, thank you, Mary, for that very nice introduction. Thank you, Chris and Ann, and good afternoon, everyone. Consider this: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the 9/11 attacks collectively over a period of 44 years resulted in the deaths of 104,720 Americans. COVID-19 killed that many Americans in a little over 4 months, and we are projected to more than triple that figure by the end of this year. And the medical toll extends far beyond those who have lost their lives, in that a substantial portion of survivors are sustaining long-term and potentially permanent damage to many parts of the body, including lungs, kidneys, brain, and cardiovascular system. In the economic arena, the number of Americans unemployed jumped in short order to levels that had not been seen since those of the Great Depression. Yet, amid all of the devastation that has occurred throughout the United States and the rest of the world, a silver lining has emerged, in that the situation is causing a growing segment of our society to recognize that the time has come for us to rethink our relationship with all life on this planet, other humans, non-humans, and the earth, a life form in itself. And as we begin to find our way through this crisis, it is imperative for us as a species to reflect deeply upon what this and other human health crises are telling us about our role in these increasingly frequent events, and about what we can do to avoid them in the future. Our failure to do so may result in the unwitting extermination of all or a good part of our species from this planet. So, what are the important messages to humanity from this crisis, and how might we act upon them before our window of opportunity closes? I'd like to share some thoughts about these issues here today. Now, although some room for doubt remains about the precise origins of this current pandemic, our best scientific understanding at present suggests that the SARS-CoV-2 virus responsible for COVID-19 originated in bats, and likely via an intermediary such as the pangolin, found its way from a wet market where live wildlife species were being sold for human consumption in Wuhan, China, to one or more humans at that location. And within months, COVID-19 had spread throughout the world with a long trail of incredible devastation, which continues to escalate. Now, in general, the US CDC observes that 3 in every 4 new or emerging infectious disease in people comes from animals, caused not only by viruses, but also by bacteria, fungi, and parasites from a variety of animal sources. And although it is tempting to, for us to lay the blame for pandemics such as COVID-19 on bats, pangolins, or other wild species, it is human behavior that is responsible for the vast majority of zoonotic diseases that jump the species barrier from animals to humans. Indeed, the alarming increase in frequency of lethal zoonotic diseases relates in large part to our human-dominated ecosystem, with increasingly unnatural human-animal close contact, with grossly aberrant crowding of animals for human purposes, destruction of animal habitats, and importantly, vast numbers of highly mobile humans to swiftly carry these diseases throughout the world. The outbreak of SARS in 2003, which was another form of severe acute respiratory syndrome prior to COVID-19, was also the result of a coronavirus that originated in bats with subsequent infection of wild animals sold in live animal street markets in China. And as Teresa already mentioned, such markets provide breeding grounds for countless zoonotic pathogens with sick, highly stressed, overcrowded animals in highly unsanitary conditions. And the opportunity for human transfer of these pathogens is increased immensely by allowing direct access to large crowds of humans. The human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which has infected 75 million people and killed 32 million since the onset of AIDS in the 1980s, originated in a type of chimpanzee in Central Africa. And scientists have generally concluded that the chimpanzee version of the virus, called simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, was transmitted to humans and mutated into HIV when humans hunted these chimpanzees for meat and came into contact with their infected blood. So, the hunting, capturing, and selling of wild animals for human consumption, particularly in connection with live animal markets, clearly constitute major public health risks, and continuing these practices will assure further human health crises with potentially even greater destructive power in the future. Now, another well-recognized source for increasingly lethal human zoonoses is the massive overcrowding of animals for human consumption in industrial factory farm environments, also known as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. And over the past 40 years, as the factory farm model has become a global phenomenon, a host of avian influenza or bird flu viruses, including H5N1, have emerged in countries with large-scale industrial poultry operations. Intensive confinement of unprecedented numbers of chickens in these facilities to lower cost has provided a fertile ground for the development of an ever-increasing supply of new pathogens. And while bird flu was once a very rare disease among chickens, today we see outbreaks occurring every year. And transmission of these diseases from chickens to humans was almost non-existent 25 years ago. Now, serious outbreaks are occurring regularly, more in the past 25 or 15 years than in the entire 20th century. The H1N1 pandemic, so-called swine flu because of its origin in pigs, was initially detected in humans in 2009 and constituted the first worldwide flu pandemic in 40 years. And the CDC estimates that over the past 10 years, the disease has killed as many as 575,000 people worldwide. Now, pigs had long been considered a possible mixing vessel for influenza viruses that originated within pigs, birds, or humans. And the CDC has concluded that this virus resulted from reassortment, a process through which two or more influenza viruses can swap genetic information by infecting a single human or animal host. Larger numbers of pigs in closer proximity provided greater opportunities for this to occur. The large-scale confinement of animals for human consumption has also played a major direct role in another ongoing health crisis in the US and around the world, namely antibiotic resistance. Nearly 80% of the antibiotics sold in the US are now used for livestock feed to prevent disease and promote growth. Intensive confinement operations require far more antibiotics than family farms, and if bacteria that naturally exist in these animals acquire antibiotic resistance genes, treatment with antibiotics becomes ineffective. constituting a threat not only to animal health, but also to human health. And humans may be exposed to antibiotic-resistant organisms by handling and eating raw or undercooked meat, by coming into contact with farm animals or their feces, and or by eating contaminated produce or drinking contaminated water, including recreational water. Robust scientific data confirm that proximity to factory farms and applying manure from factory farm operations to crop fields are both independently associated with the likelihood of humans acquiring antibiotic-resistant infections. Also, researchers from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health drove cars with windows down behind trucks that were transporting broiler chickens from farms to slaughterhouses in Virginia and Maryland. And they documented antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the air inside the cars behind the trucks, as well as on top of the soda cans in the car's cup holders. Quite astounding. Antibiotic-resistant infections constitute a major and growing global health threat and now kill an estimated 35,000 people in the US and 700,000 people worldwide per year. One further fundamental source for the increasing threat of pandemics and other human health crises is habitat destruction. Vast numbers of wildlife species are threatened with extinction from cutting down forests and expanding urban areas and industrial activities. The surviving animals are forced into closer proximity to themselves and humans, increasing the likelihood of transforming what would otherwise be benign animal microbes into deadly human pathogens. And to compound the issue, much of the land that is being lost to deforestation is being converted to land for raising more animals for human consumption. Our species has come to the edge of the cliff on these issues, and the COVID-19 pandemic is forcing us to make a choice between either changing our thinking and practices in these realms or facing increasing destruction and perhaps self-annihilation. Medical experts are painfully aware of the undeniable hazards of continuing along our current trajectory. Dr. Amish Adalja of the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security writes openly of the relatively new avian influenza H7N9 that has been considered one of the most concerning of all pandemic threats over the past few years. And although an epidemic of H7N9 began in southern China in 2013, there has to date been no sustained human-to-human transmission. Nevertheless, more than 1,500 human cases have occurred with a case fatality rate of 40% mortality. And Adalja warns that, quote, if H7N9 achieves sustained human-to-human transmission, it would arguably be the worst health and national security threat faced by the world in literally a century. An H7N9 pandemic could well be worse, perhaps much worse, than the great pandemic of 1918, end quote. And that pandemic killed an estimated 50 million people. So what is all of this telling us? Well, first of all, rather than simply attempting to react to crises like COVID-19 after death and destruction are already upon us, we need to have the vision, wisdom, and compassion to address fundamental underlying causes and act now to mitigate and prevent the numerous disasters that are literally waiting to happen. The Chinese government should be applauded for taking the much needed step of banning the trade and consumption of wild animals in China on February 24th, 2020. And although shutting down this $74 billion wildlife farming industry has been criticized by some as economically harmful, such harm pales overwhelmingly in comparison to the vast health and economic threats to China and the world involved in continuing to allow business as usual. Other nations throughout the world should also ban the trade and consumption of wild animals associated with live animal markets. And such a ban should also apply to the import, export, and internal transport of live wildlife or wildlife meat intended for sale in wildlife markets. Intensive confinement of animals for in factory farm operations should be discontinued worldwide for the sake of animals, humans, and the environment. And we should rapidly evolve to eating other forms of protein that are safer for humans, including a wide range of time-honored fundamental plant-derived food sources, as well as the more recently developed plant-based meat, dairy, and egg alternatives, and even cultured meat, which is produced by culturing animal cells. Additional investment in plant-based agriculture to grow crops to feed humans rather than livestock for human consumption would feed far more people while utilizing far less land and water, allowing for the preservation of vital ecosystems for innumerable species. The COVID-19 crisis has provided us with a wake-up call, an opportunity, and it will be important that we as a species awaken to the imperative for us to change and that we act in ways that are beneficial to all life forms. What is good for non-humans and the earth is virtually always in the best interest of humans, given the profound interconnectedness of all life. All that we do depends upon abundant plant and animal life, as well as clean air and water. And each of us can have a positive impact upon these fundamentals by demonstrating and inspiring an enhanced mindfulness, beginning most basically with what we eat and how all of our daily choices and actions may be affecting animals and natural habitats. Ultimately, the survival not only of other life forms on this planet, but also of our own, will depend upon humanity's ability to recognize the oneness of all that exists and the importance and deeper significance of compassion for all life. I thank all of you for your concern about these issues and for all that you've done, all that you're doing, and all that you're going to do on behalf of other life forms as well as humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, Teresa, and David, for sharing your expertise and your insights. The panel has demonstrated how interconnected we all truly are and how we absolutely must change the ways in which we interact and protect other species with whom we share the planet, not only for their well-being, but Dr. Weber's made the point, and ours, our own extinction is on the line. I wish we could just stop eating animals. But, you know, we need to know and confront what human behavior is doing and how it's harming wildlife and ourselves. So after these thought-provoking and appropriately alarming presentations, I'm sure that we have a number of questions from those who have tuned in to watch. And so what I'd like to do now is to turn it over to Ann Lewis from City Wildlife, who will share questions and comments from viewers with the panel. Ann?
Thank you, Mary. Let's see, you can hear me. Let's see if I can. There we go. we've had a number of very interesting questions. These were fantastic talks, and I'm so grateful to our speakers for preparing these talks specifically for this presentation. Some of the questions have already been answered in the talks, but there are a few interesting ones. And I'm going to deal with the ones that deal with the speakers first, because some of the speakers have to leave quickly. One of the questions that was asked was how we know that this virus originated in the wildlife markets and not in the research laboratories in China. If anybody, I don't know if David is still on, or John can answer that. I think that's not quite known yet. Is David still here? Or John, do you want to answer that?
I would.
Wait. Unmute yourself.
Okay, I would if I could, but I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure that it's been resolved yet. But based on what I read, which is what everybody else does, and certainly I don't know any more than anybody else does, the indicators are that it was from this kind of market trade.
Mm-hmm. I know that the lab.
Anne, I'm here.
Oh, good.
But I've got to leave here in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Listen, there's fairly convincing evidence based on a genetic analysis of the virus and comparing that to the genetic analysis of viruses in bats as opposed to what can be constructed in the lab. Most of the scientific community is quite convinced that it did not come from a manufacturing feat of the Chinese or anyone else.
Thank you. There's a question about deer in Rock Creek Park. There have been several dead deer in Rock Creek Park, and the question was, could these deer have, there's a certain area that was treated with poisons over the summer to try to control invasive plants. Could poison have anything to do with the deer deaths? Is there something more going on? John, do you want to answer that?
Well, I can try. We wouldn't know unless we had submitted samples for analysis. But I've never, in my experience, seen deer die from poisoning through plant treatments. It's more of a problem with birds. We get, some birds that go into shock after they've eaten on treated lawns, but with certain products, and that generally in the past has led to those products being banned, except for extremely unusual circumstances. So my suspicion would be no, and I think the Park Service folks would have submitted the deer or, necropsy, tried to necropsy them if they suspected that themselves.
Thank you. There's a question for Mary Che. What can the City Council do, or what are they doing to promote moving toward a plant-based diet in programs that are funded by DC, like schools, shelters, etc.?
Well, one of the things that we've done has been through the Healthy Schools Act that I passed some years ago, and that is to have our students, and I think they are our future, really engage with the idea of a vegetarian diet. And also, I have, after the Healthy Schools Act, I've pushed through the Healthy Parks Act, the Healthy Tots Act, the Healthy This Act, and the Healthy That Act. And another one that's waiting for some action would be the Healthy Hospitals Act. Now, this is not a completely transformative set of pieces of legislation, but it's a way of moving us, I hope, from meat eating to plant-based eating. So that's one thing. And you know, as I said, I really think our hope lies with the next generation and with younger folks. And also, I'm very pleased to say, although this is not something from the District of Columbia, I am impressed, you know, when I speak to colleagues and friends and that sort of thing, with how many people have been willing to try a vegetarian diet and have had good experiences with things like, I'm trying to think of the name of them, but, you know, fake hamburgers and that sort of thing. So I would like to do more, but you know, there's only so much that the government can do. We can't actually prescribe that people stop eating meat. And another thing I would say, that, however, is that any reduction is helpful. And I want to add something here, which dovetails with some of the comments that were made about how this is not, you know, atomistic, how we're all joined together. I've recently been asked by the Council of Governments to head a committee about agriculture. And so we'll be looking at the regional agriculture. And I was very impressed with the slides that talked about how animals are kept. I think we should add to our agenda the whole issue about farm, industrial type farming. And we have already on our agenda the idea of moving to smaller sustainable farms, both for the farmers and farm to table connections, but also now with this additional dimension. So we're doing something, but maybe we could do more.
Thank you. There's a question about Lyme disease, whether the increased prevalence of Lyme disease is a result of human impact on the environment. Do you have any sense of that, John?
Yeah, I generally would say yes. Humans have a tremendous role to play in the prevalence, the presence and the prevalence of Lyme disease. It's a complex issue. It has to do with all of the hosts for the tick that is the main vector for Lyme disease, the black-legged tick, which spends part of its life on mice as a nymph, and then as an adult on deer. We've managed environments to create better habitat, to reduce natural predation on both those species, as well as we manage the environment to eliminate fire, which could have been, in my personal opinion, an important control on ticks, just these slow, very low intensity ground fires that we used to experience over wide amounts of land every year. All those things are factors. We talk about ecotones, the transition between natural and developed habitats, as contributing to that problem. So yeah.
And I'm sorry, can I add
Sure.
something here?
Yeah.
You know, climate change and with higher temperatures, my understanding is that ticks survive longer and able to spread disease longer. And is it true? I mean, I can ask our panelists that we ditched a vaccine for Lyme disease because of hysteria over vaccines. Does anybody have the background information on that?
I don't know specifically about that. You're certainly right about the climate change. That's definitely a contributing factor, and thank you for raising that. The vaccine that was approved or was tested and in use for Lyme, I think was just not, I think there were complications with it. But it's a mystery to me why we don't, given the prevalence of Lyme disease and its terrible impact on people, why we haven't pushed through a research program that has led us to a usable vaccine.
Next question. I don't disagree with moving more toward a plant-based diet, but what about the land use and water needed to make that diet possible? I understand these are some of the same issues with factory farming, but what about small farms? John, I think that's you.
That's me again?
I think so.
I am all for small farms. I think that, that is an important cornerstone to who we've been and what we've done as a country, and that it needs to be completely reevaluated and reinstalled. And um, I'm not sure that it would take more land than is currently consumed in the provision of fodder for animals in production. The Midwest is one huge corn basket that is, basically being raised to feed livestock. So uh, others would have a better understanding of exactly how much land it would take and whether it would even take any land at all, since hydroponics could offer, one opportunity to raise a whole bunch of plant material without sequestering land. But I think it could be done. It definitely could be done pretty easily.
Can I add something here? Again, I'm sorry. In terms of this look at the region, with the major crop that's grown is corn. But only 1% of that corn goes to your food table. The rest of it, as you indicated, is for livestock or for sugar in various products. So when we think about how we might construct sensibly, humanely, a farming system, we have to think about all the byproducts and ramifications of maintaining these huge numbers of animals in horrific conditions, we should add, and all that matters. So I think, if I were to trade whatever land and water would be needed for a plant-based diet, and eliminate not just the animals and how they're treated and everything else, but what the plants are now used for to maintain them, I think we'd have a good deal, great deal, to move to a plant-based diet. We'd make out very well.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions and the intents of questions. And one is, why can't we just all become vegan now? And another kind of related question is, what drives these markets for wildlife? Why do people buy them? And I think what we're talking about is a cultural change that's needed. And I'll answer this question because I think it's a very difficult but central question to the whole discussion. And that is, I'm almost 77, and back in the day when I was a kid, being a vegetarian was really weird. Only beatniks and bohemians in England, members of the Vegetarian Society, were vegetarians. And now, admittedly, I'm in an animal-loving world, but just about everybody I know is a vegetarian. And I think 10% of the population in America is now vegetarian. And the issue now isn't vegetarian, it's why aren't you vegan? So I think we all have to have patience in terms of social movements. No movement happens overnight, and it takes a lot of peer pressure and a lot of functional alternatives and a lot of social movement in a group to change any sort of social mores. I mean, look at gay rights and what it took. We now have gay rights, and God willing, we'll still keep them. But vegetarianism is definitely growing, and so is veganism. But it's going to take the production of a lot of alternatives to meat, which is happening now, a lot of cataclysmic change to the environment where people say, my God, my grandkids are going to die if I don't become vegan. It takes a village, as they say, and we have to look back and see how far we've come in some of these movements. 10% vegetarians in America is a huge sea change, and it's only growing. So my point is that I think a lot of this is cultural and mass marketing, and also the production of tasty and nutritional alternatives, which is happening. I believe this will happen, but I think it's taking time. So I answered that question probably at length. And one, we only have a few questions left. One is, what do you see as the role of citizen science and a local naturalist community to grow a culture of attentiveness and compassion with the living world? John, you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely one of the most, productive and interesting and exciting things that's happened. This whole citizen science movement to us recently. It engages people at a level that they feel like they're directly involved, and as they are with a lot of these initiatives, and it reinforces them by building and creating a community of like-minded people, and it educates us all. I mean, there's always something more to learn. Traditional ways of doing that would be to get together with a group of your peers, or have a weekly coffee with cohorts and friends who had interest in the natural world and talk about things. But boy, you can just do it on a whole different scale now. I think it's great.
The last question that I think we have time for is, and I'm not sure any of us know much about this, but it is an issue. It's the issue of animal poaching in Africa. It's been on the rise this year due to the reduced presence of staff and tourists at many parks and preserves around the world during the pandemic, which has emboldened poachers. I'm wondering if anything is being done to mitigate this. Are you aware, John? I know that African Wildlife Foundation and many of the other African wildlife protection groups are doing all kinds of things to mitigate this, training guards and setting aside wildlife parks. But the problem is, with the pandemic, the poachers there are more poachers from what I'm reading, and they're having trouble controlling and having enough guards who are willing to risk their lives to go out there and apprehend the poachers. It's a very serious problem, and
Yeah,
we
and
should all be aware of it.
it's a very complex problem as
Yeah.
well. So it sometimes seems like we're running in place, if not losing ground on it.
Mhm.
And I know just from hanging out with people like Teresa and talking to them that it just continues to be a struggle. That there's more advanced technology and weaponry available to poachers. They are more incentivized through the wildlife trade and the markets. I don't know if Teresa made this point in a way that got through to everybody, but this wildlife trade business is huge. I mean, it is big business, worth billions of dollars. And the incentive there is making money. The people that are on the front line of making that money often have no other source of income and are more or less desperate to do anything through that can lead to them being able to raise money for themselves and their families, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to be encouraging about it. It's a real struggle. It's a real fight. But there are, as you mentioned, wonderful organizations and people who are constantly trying to figure out ways to do it and to do it effectively.
And can I just add something here? And John, you've mentioned this, and others mentioned this throughout. It's absolutely vital that we provide alternatives to people who depend for their livelihood on trade in animals. And if we don't take care of that end of it, people will take their chances. They'll engage in violent behavior even, because basically this is how they survive. So we have to have viable alternatives to these economic, if you will, activities. But you all have mentioned that throughout, and that's absolutely indispensable to breaking into this illegal trade.
We have a couple of late coming questions. Let me just read them. Are factory farms required to routinely screen for pathogens like avian flu And are broiler chickens particularly susceptible to infections? I think we need Teresa for that. Do you know the answer, John?
Well, I'll share my sense of it. I don't know whether it's 100% accurate or not. I think that the factory farming business is terribly concerned about the impact of diseases on the animals that are so crowded, so stressed, so forced into conditions in which disease transmission occurs. It's strictly economic. They don't want to lose any profits. They don't want animals to die of diseases. Whether or not there's a lot of care and concern or a lot of caution and a lot of things in place to prevent the escape of pathogens from their facilities, I rather suspect not, but I don't know for sure.
And the last real question, which is not such a question, but it's a comment, and she describes it as a hot button, and it is a hot button. But the comment is, the world is overpopulated. We need to support education, social power, and the availability of control to control our own reproduction. And, you know, this has been going on. My mother was involved in Planned Parenthood in the 40s. And this has been going on for a long time. China had the one-child rule, and now they don't have that anymore. But of course, this is a central issue of our time, but it's also politically very difficult because you have to choose, or maybe we don't have to choose, whose population are we controlling. And maybe if the world comes together in one mind, that population control is an issue that affects everybody in ways that affect them personally, regardless of their nationality or the standing of their country. It may be that the world begins to understand that we should limit our population. And it is going down. You know, the rate of increase is decreasing. So it may happen because we're all wiped out. That's the other possibility. But I think it's a question that everybody dodges, and we probably need to re-energize this question and figure out how is it best to get everybody on the same page, regardless of what the technique is to control the population, so that it isn't discriminatory or doesn't negatively affect any particular population over another. Do you all have any thoughts about that?
Well, what little I know from having taken courses in demography, the answer seems to be that you give people a better standard of living, and the number of births comes down. Mm-hmm. So it's one of these social justice type issues where you have to raise the standard of living for people mm-hmm. in order to get at the problem. But you're right on, spot on. It's the big problem. It's the cause of everything that we've talked about today and more.
On that cheery note, I think we can close our seminar unless the panelists or anybody does anyone have any further comments? Okay, I think this has been a fabulous educational experience for the panelists as well as others. And our time is up, so I'm going to close the meeting and thank everybody so much for coming. As Chris said, the meeting, we hope to make this recording, if it turned out to be a good recording, available to people. And of course, John and Mary and Chris and I are in town. So if we didn't get to some of these questions in the time, please feel free to reach out to us through City Wildlife or DSEN or the council and ask these questions. We can continue this conversation.